Hey everybody, we are looking at section 18.2 today, which is going to build upon what we talked about in the last screencast and looking at evolution in a population over a period of time. So again, we're not focused on these big picture items, but smaller groups. How do they evolve over time? And, what does that mean in terms of how their genes and chromosomes may be changing it as part of that, okay? So go ahead and get the title, section 18.2, Evolution as Genetic Change. And with this section, we're going to talk about really a whole bunch of different factors that can lead to a change in different populations. And so some of those things are to look at things that we call genetic drift or gene flow or random mutation or sexual selection versus natural selection. And so we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at all of those kind of individually. Where we're going to start today, though, is in talking about something called microevolution, which is this idea of smaller groups kind of evolving over time. So not large species on the whole, but small populations that are maybe isolated in certain areas, how they can change over time. So when we talk about the word microevolution, like you see on the slide here, remember, think micro means small, right? So this is evolution on a fairly limited and smaller scale. So natural selection, like we had mentioned back in chapter 17, is focused on, again, changing allele frequencies, changing populations over time, right? And so when we look at single gene traits, we can pretty easily kind of track how those changes are occurring. So if we have an individual trait, like here we're looking at lizard survival and color, right? So the initial population, you can see the majority were this tannish brownish color. And we had one individual, it looks like out of 10, representing 10% of the population that was this orangish color. And then again, an equivalent number of the darker phenotype, the darker trait. Over time, over 10 generations, 20, and then 30, you can see how these populations are kind of changing, right? If this is one whole group, well, it seems pretty obvious that this darker trait becomes more beneficial, right? It becomes better for survival. So over time, the number of brownish, tannish colors decrease, and the numbers of lizards that have the darker trait are going to increase. So chances are that would have something to do with maybe camouflage or a change in predator. But regardless, this is a type of change that we can kind of monitor and look at on the level of specific genes if we're talking about simple kind of inheritance, okay? So when we talk about microevolution, we're looking at specifically like what you just saw right there. So a change in a population on a very small scale, and usually we're tracking just a single type of trait. So it could be with Darwin's finches, looking at beak size or beak thickness. You could talk about the tortoise's, the length of its neck or the height that it's able to kind of stand up, right, to reach up to those higher plants. But we have three different types of microevolution. We say that natural selection can act on these in kind of three different manners. So you can have what we call directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. We're going to go through each one of these one at a time. So directional selection here is, to me, always the one that makes the most sense, right? It's movement of what we're selecting for in a direction. So what we're looking at specifically is, this is where natural selection, where nature, where the environment is going to favor a trait found at the extreme. Okay, so the example here is with Darwin's finches, the finches that were on the Galapagos Islands. And remember, the scenario was you had these finches that over time, when the environment changed and there was a drought, their beak size and shape, those that had the stronger, thicker, larger beaks were able to find more food because they weren't strictly reliant on those smaller plant type items. They could eat larger nuts and things that had to be kind of cracked open. And so those guys were the ones that ended up surviving. So if we think about beak size here, and so here we're looking at the y-axis, this is our population. So number of birds in the population. And the majority of the birds, we would say here normally, the dashed line again represents my original distribution, my original population. The majority here have an average size beak, right? And so if there was a drought and it became more beneficial to have the larger beak size, right, what we end up seeing is a shift in this curve. So we go from having this relatively kind of normal spread of traits. We have those that have smaller and those that just tend to have bigger, and then most people fall in that average. Well, with the drought, we see, it becomes better to have that larger beak. And so over time, what that means is that the population will actually shift so that that larger beak size actually becomes more common. So, the peak of my hill here, where I have the largest number of individuals, it was at one point one extreme, way on the end, without many individuals kind of, expressing that trait in that way. So, in other words, in directional selection, we have traits and characteristics that were once maybe pretty rare in a population that become more common. And as they become more common, the distribution, this curve that we're looking at here, the variation in these traits also kind of follows and goes in that same direction. I guess in this slide, I should go this direction. But that's that idea of directional selection. So we see this often with camouflage. We can see this with even like human height over time has been increasing. Human shoe size, same idea, right? As height goes up, shoe size also has to go up. But we know that it's become more beneficial in terms of survival for humans over time to get taller and taller and taller. And so that would also be an example here of directional selection. Okay, stabilizing selection is the second type, and this is where we have natural selection that favors the intermediate phenotype. And so what we mean by this is we have a selection against the extremes. In other words, what tends to happen is the individuals become more alike. This can actually be a pretty detrimental thing for a population because it has the effect of decreasing variation. So what we mean by that is instead of having, Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands with, a wide variety of beak sizes with very small and very large here, these guys continue to be selected for in that environment if the environment doesn't change. And so the peak here gets higher. More individuals have that average size beak. But if there's a drought, we don't have nearly as many individuals here that can adapt and survive and then pass down those genes to their offspring. So this can be dangerous because it's actually decreasing variation in a population. Okay. Disruptive selection is the opposite of stabilizing. So instead of becoming more narrow with our curve, right, and kind of increasing the height of that hill, in disruptive, we're totally breaking it apart. Disruptive selection tends to happen when we have one population that for whatever reason gets split up. It could be split based on time and behavior. It could be split based on geographical barriers, like the finches that originally landed on the Galapagos Islands. They would have had to come from somewhere, right? So that distance between the islands and the mainland became what was their separating kind of force. And so what we get as a result of that, what we usually call this is divergent evolution, where things become more and more different from one another, so much so that eventually this can lead to the formation of two completely different species. Okay. But again, just basic premise of this here is that we're selecting for two extremes, one here at one end of the scale and then the other here at the other end. And they have to be selected for simultaneously, okay, within the same population. Okay, so thinking about these processes, right? What can actually lead to all of this kind of happening? One of the things we have to recognize is that within populations in nature, there's going to be a lot of movement between different groups. Gene flow is this concept that individuals move between populations. It says that, we can immigrate with an I, excuse me, and move into a population, or also emigrate with an E and exit the population. When individuals move into a population, we say that their alleles become part of that population's gene pool. Okay, so we're actually kind of in effect increasing the variation there of the gene pool that they're adding their alleles to. However, in contrast to that, wherever they came from, they've actually decreased the variation in that original gene pool. Okay, but gene flow generally increases variation in those receiving populations in the places where individuals are moving into. And then again, it's going to decrease that variation in places where they're coming from, okay? But gene flow is this idea of just physical movement, right? One individual moving to somewhere else, okay? If we think about genetic drift, which in my mind, I've always struggled with these two terms because they sound very similar. I think of flow and drift, right? I mean, it kind of sounds similar, but the difference is gene flow is purposeful, all right? Like an individual or a group choosing to go from one place to another, right? They're moving on purpose for a specific reason. Genetic drift, on the other hand, is completely random. All right, so this word right here is really important. Random change in allele frequency due to chance. So we say genetic drift can happen and affect a population if we have a couple of different types of effects. If we have different events, I could say that cause a population to become small in size, we can have genetic drift occur as a result of that. So there are two different kind of processes by which we can get genetic drift to occur. In other words, two different ways by which we can make populations very small so that this randomness has a larger impact. So we call these the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. And I can't remember. Let me make sure and see if I've got them both here. So I'm going to go through each one of those on their own. But looking at this here, the idea is that we start with an original population where we have an equal number of all these different colors. And then based on the chance events, certain individuals get wiped out. And it may just be like, hey, you were in the right place at the right time. Okay, it may not even be survival of the fittest. And then as a result of that, our population changes here to reflect that chance event. It's not necessarily that the yellow ones were bad for survival. It's just that they happen to get wiped out. Okay. So the first of the two different kind of events that can happen that cause populations to become super small is the bottleneck effect. Bottleneck effects happen when you have an event that dramatically reduces a population size. This can be triggered by things like natural disasters, global climate change, human activities, but these are more of those kind of unpredictable types of events. I always like to think of a scenario with palm trees on a tropical island, right? So if we think about that on a tropical island, let's say that we have a hurricane or a tsunami that's coming along, and certain palm trees get just completely demolished, right? Now, which ones get demolished truly has nothing to do with their genetic makeup or their traits specifically, just happens to do with more, where are they found and where is that hurricane or tsunami headed, right? So if they happen to be kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, if they're on one part of the beach and the hurricane strikes the other or vice versa, that can lead to certain death for those palm trees, right? So when we think about bottleneck effect, these are often, again, kind of unpredictable, random in nature. But what they do is they severely limit a population size. So the analogy here is of beads in a bottle. If we have an equivalent number of yellow and blue beads here in this parent population, and we take that bottle and we just turn it upside down and shake a few out, well, the mixture that I'm going to get is usually going to be kind of a random mix of, in this case, blue and yellow beads. It has nothing to do with, again, who has the best traits. It's simply who happens to be at the top, right, and actually falls out when I dump them out. Those surviving individuals, though, they're the ones that get to reproduce, and over time that causes the next generation and the one after that to change in accordance to whatever was left over. Okay, so this is a change in a group, but it's not necessarily good in terms of survival because sometimes you get some interesting things becoming more common that aren't necessarily helpful. Okay, the second type of effect is called the founder effect, and this is I always like to think of the founding fathers. So this is where you have a small group of individuals that choose to move somewhere, okay, and create a new kind of place. Now, this is not the same as gene flow because these are creating new communities and populations in places where none existed before. Okay, so they go to a brand new place. If you think about a deserted island or something, or even the first groups of people that came to the United States, they weren't necessarily the best representation of the genes that were present in the original group. They maybe made that choice for religious reasons, for other reasons beyond that, if we're thinking about just a hypothetical situation. But for regardless of what those choices were, the genes that they have don't necessarily match up with what's best for survival, if that makes sense. So if we think about these two groups right here, I've got two groups of beetles, right? And I have founding populations. So my original group kind of consisted of yellows, reds, and gray. And so if there are these four right here, we'll take the pathway up at the top here, that choose to move to a new place, okay, and colonize a new area for this beetle population. Well, this is my founding population, and the resulting offspring will be simply yellow and gray. We're completely missing the red, right? Because the red beetles, for whatever reason, just didn't choose to move that way. This scenario down here is kind of the opposite. You take yellow and red, and they choose to go, and now all of a sudden the gray has disappeared. So with the founder effect and genetic drift like this, we don't necessarily see the best traits surviving, but we see some kind of randomness associated with how these individuals are passing on genetic information. Okay, so switching gears just a little bit, in addition to gene flow, in addition to genetic drift, we can also have other forms of selection that can lead to a population changing over time. Sexual selection is one of those forms of selection. So in addition to natural selection, sexual selection is an added component here. So this is where certain traits are going to increase mating success between males and females. And of course, we're thinking about specifically animals in this case. There are two different types of selection here. There's intersexual selection and intrasexual selection. The difference being that inter is between males kind of trying to attract a female. So it's between males and females. Males are trying to display certain traits to attract those female individuals. We see this an awful lot with birds, okay, and sometimes also fish. They display certain traits, and birds specifically have songs and sometimes dances and behaviors that they do in order to try and attract the female. Intrasexual selection, on the other hand, though, is where males actually physically fight with other males to get the attention of a female and actually kind of win the mating rights to them. So we can see this with lots of different species. You've got male deer here. Bighorn sheep do this. Moose will do this. They physically fight for kind of the right to mate with several different females. Gorillas do this. There's lots of examples. But again, the major difference here is how is that attraction kind of happening, right? Intersexual is males displaying things in kind of a non-violent way, if you want to think about it that way. And then intrasexual selection is just the physical altercations that occur in order to attract females. Now, the downside of this, kind of like genetic drift, is that sometimes what's good in terms of attracting a female or winning the rights to mate with a female are not actually going to be good for survival of that species or even that individual. Fish, for example, male fish are brightly colored. There are lots of examples of male fish being brightly colored, and same with birds actually too. The birds that are male tend to have those more brightly colored, noticeable kind of feather patterns. Females don't, because their major role is going to be to protect the young, and so they need to be camouflaged a little bit better. But the fact that the males are colorful anyway, whether they're fish or birds, means that they're going to attract more predators. And so there's kind of a balance here, right? They want to attract a mate, which means they want to be brightly colored, but they don't want to attract predators, right? So there's kind of it's a little bit of a catch-22 in this case, right? Because you've got some are beneficial and others are detrimental, and what's going to be the correct combination, okay? So when we think about this process, let me move some things around here. Whoa. All right. So in thinking about all the stuff we just talked about here in this section, all of those kind of processes have to be present if a population is evolving, okay? So any of these conditions can lead to that natural selection process. If none of them are occurring, then we would say the population is kind of remaining stagnant. It's exactly the same. It's not changing. So when a population is not evolving, there's this term that scientists have come up with, which is to say that the population is in a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Hardy and Weinberg were the two biologists who created this little theory. But the idea, again, is that if sexual selection genetic drift, gene flow, random mutations, and then microevolution. If those conditions are present, any one of them at a single time, then that would say that we have evolution occurring. Okay. If those processes, if all 5 of them are missing, if there's no sexual selection, if there's no genetic drift or randomness, if there's no gene flow or movement, if there's no random mutations in the chromosomes that make up our cells that we inherit from our parents and that contain our genes and our DNA, and if there's no microevolution, no directional stabilizing or disruptive evolution, then we do not get any type of natural selection or change over time. But if any one of those factors is present, then there's going to be changes occurring in that population that can accumulate and then therefore change the population as a whole. So evolution occurs, again, let me say it one more time. Evolution, we say, occurs for any population or species if at least sexual selection or genetic drift or gene flow and movement or mutations or microevolution are occurring. Okay, so all of these terms that we just talked about, all of these are different factors that play into this idea of natural selection kind of taking part in evolution, taking part in driving these changes in populations that we see kind of globally. But keep in mind, it's not just natural selection, right? We just saw that there are several other factors that play into the cards here. So again, sexual selection, genetic drift, gene flow, mutations, and microevolution. And I keep saying those because I do need you to know all 5 of those. So make sure you've got those jotted down. You should have them from previous slides, or write them down again here along with the Hardy-Weinberg principle, that definition. That would be really helpful as well. Okay, so that's the end of the section. If y'all need anything else, don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next time for 18.3. Bye, guys.